You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Roxanne Barber. I'm one of the co-founders of Retake Our Democracy.
And I'm Paul Gibson, the other co-founder of Retake Our Democracy.
And welcome to our discussion tonight on how PNM runs circles around the PRC and our legislature. There have been a lot of conflicting claims about the PRC and the Energy Transformation Act. And we hope that by the time, Energy Transition Act. We hope that by the time we're done tonight, we'll have clarified a good deal of the confusion related to the PRC, to PNM, and to the Energy Transition Act. So let's welcome our panelists tonight. They are 6 members. Wait, 1, 2, 3, there's only 5. Oh, I'm sorry, and Paul. 6 members of an activist group called PNM Shareholders for a Responsible Future. And you'll hear all about how they got started a little bit later. And those, our panelists are Wendy Volkman, Dee Homans and Andy Davis, Sam Hitt, and Ann Lacey, and Paul Gibson.
And we've got Saraswati Khalsa, who is managing the slides that we're going to be showing as well. So before we get started, I want to acknowledge that this Zoominar is taking place on Tewa land, stolen Tewa land, and we want to take a moment to thank them for their stewardship over the centuries. We also want to send out, our support to those indigenous people in Navajo and Hopi Nation who are undergoing just a horrible onslaught from the coronavirus. And so we want to offer our support as best we can. I also want to just send out hopes to all of you who are on the call. I hope you're staying safe, healthy, and hopeful. We got to stay hopeful. And before we begin, in the chat bar, you'll find a link to information about upcoming Zoominars. We've got quite a few of them coming up, and where you can view past Zoominars, and you can even view this one if you want to watch it twice.
You might need to scroll to the top of the chat to see that link, because we've had some other chat messages come through since then.
So our next Zoominar is going to be on June 23rd, and it's going to be with the leadership from the Public Banking Initiative in Mexico. And then following that, we're going to have the leadership from the Health Security Act. The people of Mary Feldblum and Dana will be on with us, and that should also be quite important. Dana Millen, yes. And after that, we've got a couple of other really good Zoominars that are going to be unfolding in July. So check that out when you get a chance. And seeing, I want to try and contextualize what, I'm sorry, I got lost there. I turned to the wrong page. I wanted to see, this is just to make our other panelists feel comfortable, because they're not used to doing this. Okay, so before I go on and try and set the context for the discussion that's going to follow, Roxanne's going to lay out how the Zoominar works.
Right, and I know that most of you probably already know these things, but we always have a few people at least who are new to Zoom. So I'll just tell you really quickly. This is in a webinar format. It's not like a regular Zoom meeting. So you can only see, and everyone can only see the panelists and hear us. So you won't be able to speak or to see any of the attendees. So at the bottom of your screen is a toolbar. If you don't see that toolbar, just take your cursor and hover down underneath the video of everyone, and you'll see some options there. One of those is chat, and that chat window will open once you click on that on the right side of your screen, and you're welcome to comment throughout the program. But for posing questions to the panelists, which we're going to look at and answer in the last half hour, please use the Q&A function, which is also in that bottom toolbar. But if you want to make a comment on chat, or if you want to comment on someone else's comment, feel free to do that as we move through the program. So, but we use Q&A button for the questions. Also, I wanted to mention that on your screen, in the black part of your screen, up on the top right corner, you have the option of clicking on speaker view, which gives you just a larger view of whoever happens to be speaking, with a little like film roll at the top of the other panelists. So if you want speaker view, do that. If you want to see all the panelists at the same time, then you need to click on gallery view. Okay, so I'm going to be moderating the discussion tonight because Paul is actually going to be one of the panelists, so that's a little bit different. We don't really have time limits, but we're asking panelists to keep their answers to five minutes or so, or less. And we're going to answer a series of prepared questions until about 7:30, and then, as I said, at 7:30 we're going to open it up to the attendees' questions, which you can put in the Q&A. Okay. Oh, and then I think we already mentioned this, but just for full disclosure, Paul and I are also members of this group, PNM Shareholders for a Responsible Future, and that is why he's sitting in as one of the panelists tonight. And I think before we start with our questions, Paul's going to give us a little context for the discussion.
Okay, so for years, there's been controversy over how the PRC has regulated New Mexico's utilities, including PNM. The PRC essentially rubber stamped pretty much anything the utilities requested for many years. And then in 2018, 3 new commissioners were elected. And I think that PNM saw the writing on the wall. These were commissioners who were going to hold them accountable and question some of their decisions. And so PNM figured out that they needed some kind of legislative strategy to address this concern. And they happened upon the ETA, the Energy Transition Act. And so with that, they were able to kind of, what's the word, stifle the PRC and restrict its regulatory capacity. And many of you probably were caught in a crossfire of a dueling and conflicting commentary from environmental groups and legislators about what the ETA was and whether or not it restricted the PRC, whether gas would be allowable or any of those kinds of things. There were a lot of conflicting emails from organizations about that. And we're hoping that today's discussion will help you understand this once and for all. And so we're going to be wrestling with a lot of issues today. And I think you're in for a illuminating hour and a half.
Great. One more comment I want to make, and I just want to say I was just skimmed through the attendees, and we've got people from all over the state, so welcome everybody. We're really happy that you could be with us tonight. I just want to say the members of this group are not experts. They're all volunteers. They're activists, just like a lot of you on this call. And most of them initially came to this work without really understanding a lot about the PRC or about shareholder activism. But over the last 5 years, they've learned a lot, and they're going to share what they've learned with you tonight. So welcome, everyone. We're going to start with our questions now. First question, well, not really a question, but I'm going to ask each of you to speak for a minute or less and just tell us who you are and what brought you to this group. So why don't you go ahead and start, Anne?
My name is Ann Lacey, and I've been involved in land use and water issues for many years. But it's
Can you get a little closer to your computer mic, because I'm not hearing you very well? If you can.
My name is Ann Lacey, and I've been involved for years in land use and water issues, but it's becoming increasingly critical with global warming that we need to move much faster to solutions, sustainable solutions. And that's why energy became a big source of a problem, basically, for what we need to do next.
Okay, thanks. Wendy?
Hi, I'm Wendy Volkman, and I had heard about shareholder activism for many years, but I had never participated. And then I met Charlotte Levinson, who was one of our founding members, who is not here tonight, but she is a founding member. And it sounded interesting to me, and I just decided to get involved.
Great. Sam?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sam Hitt, and I've been involved in forest issues for several decades here in New Mexico. I got interested again through Charlotte. She was a real spark plug in the early days of our group. And shareholder activism is just a way to, it's another way to get the issues addressed around climate and you know, the larger issues around climate. Yeah.
Thanks. Dee? You need to unmute.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm Dee Homans. I'm an artist. This is not my milieu at all, but it was, you know, through the urgency to do something about climate change that got me involved.
Great. Andy?
My name is Andy Davis, and I'm a cabinet maker and a writer. And back in the 80s, so now almost 40 years ago, I got involved through love of Chaco with the fight against what was then a proposed power plant by PNM and coal mining in the Chaco area. So this is a curse that's come back to haunt me again. It's got me involved again.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so.
What about me?
Oh, I'm sorry. I keep forgetting that Paul's one of the panelists.
Forgetting about me. I'm Paul Gibson, and you guys know me. But my path to this was through Sam and Dee and Andy, really. I heard about what they were doing, and it seemed like an interesting way to get inside PNM and be able to kind of force them to confront some questions that they would much prefer to not confront. And we're going to talk about that right now.
Okay. So we're going to start with Wendy. And can you explain to everyone on the call tonight exactly what is shareholder activism, and tell us how PNM Shareholders for a Responsible Future was formed?
You bet. Well, you know, before we talk about shareholder activism, I think we have to talk a little bit about PNM first. And PNM's full name is the Public Service Company of New Mexico. But the word public is kind of misleading. And make no mistake, it's a private for-profit company. And as such, it's legally mandated to make as much profit as possible as it can for its shareholders. And while its most fundamental purpose is to maximize profits, it was granted monopoly status, meaning that PNM is the sole operator of energy transmission in their surface area. So in exchange for being a monopoly, PNM is required to balance the interest of their profit-earning shareholders with the interest of its New Mexico customers, their ratepayers that they sell electricity to. So there's no other game in town. I mean, unless you go solar, even if you go solar, if you install solar off the grid, then you can get your electricity without PNM. But I've installed solar on my house, but I'm on the grid, so I'm still working with PNM. Another part of their monopoly charter is that they have to submit to regulation, and that's by the PRC, the Public Regulation Commission, which also regulates other things, but they regulate PNM. And the PRC is charged with ensuring that PNM delivers the least expensive possible energy for ratepayers. And there are hearings where PNM and actually other entities also present testimony regarding any given proposed PNM action and the criteria that these actions, they have to be prudent. This is the terminology, and in the best interests of ratepayers. So the PRC's job is to look out for us. ratepayers. Some of my co-presenters here, Dee and Andy and Sam and Paul, who we keep forgetting about, and noticed that what I guess Paul really kind of went over this. I was going to say that the PNM kept getting what they wanted from the PRC, and that the ratepayers' interests were sort of repeatedly overrun. And so those guys started this group, and they were wondering if shareholder activism could be kind of a good way to interrupt that pattern. And they invited me to join, and our little group was born, and here we are. Okay, so what is shareholder activism? It's a method of engaging a company, basically, about its policies and its practices. When you buy stock in a company like PNM, you become eligible to attend their annual shareholder meeting. And you actually have to own more stock. You have to buy a minimum of $2,000 worth of stock, and you have to own it for a whole year in order to be eligible to submit resolutions. So we just have 3 members that meet that higher threshold and submit resolutions. And then the rest of us, we attend the annual meeting to support those resolutions and to raise questions regarding social and environmental and governance concerns about the company. Resolutions, in truth, they're only ever recommendations. If one passes, the company is not obliged to adopt it or to implement it, but it does let the company know that its shareholders care about the issue or issues that we raise, and it applies pressure on management. So when our group attends the annual meeting, we get 2 opportunities to speak. The first is when our team members present the resolutions. We make comments in support of them. And then there's a whole Q&A section where we raise other issues. And the idea is basically to expose as many company risks as possible, like harms to the environment or to people. And we encourage more company transparency and ask PNM to do the right thing around a host of issues, whatever we think is most up that year. The meeting is recorded, and large institutional investors can listen in. And so this is our opportunity to bring our concerns to the attention not only of PNM, but also to investors. And the last thing, Roxanne, you kind of touched on this, but I just wanted to testify that before engaging in this work, I really didn't know anything about PNM. I didn't know what the PRC was, and I didn't know anything about electric utilities. And if I'm really honest with you, I would tell you that it kind of put a glaze in my eyes, the whole topic. But as I learned about PNM as a company, and I realized that that's exactly where they want us. Exactly. When we don't understand the issues, they have us right where they want us, uninformed and disempowered. So to this day, I am no expert, and no one in our group is. We're just people who care about the earth and who care about people, especially low-income New Mexicans who can't afford unnecessary rate hikes and who bear the brunt of toxic pollution. So we really want you to get that tonight, that we're not experts, we're just concerned citizens who are willing to keep learning and keep trying to make a difference, and that's really all it takes. And we want you to know that because secretly we're hoping that maybe some of you will get excited about this work and want to join our group. And we do have fun too.
So I'd just like to inject that.
Did I answer your question?
Sure, yes, thanks.
Okay.
I'd just like to inject that she's shortchanging the group, because I think over the years they may have entered this kind of naive or ignorant about some of the issues, but they've definitely done their homework.
And it's a group of really smart, great people. So we're gonna go on to the next question, and I want to let everybody know, if you've been on our other Zoominars, we're doing it a little differently tonight. We have a lot more slides to show you. We're gonna try not to beat you over the head with too many slides, but we are gonna be showing you slides, and keep them on the screen maybe just 30 seconds or so, and then we'll go back to the person who's speaking, because we just think that watching someone speak is a little more interesting than looking at slides. So So Dee, this question is for you. It's a multi-part question. Can you tell us what kinds of resolutions the group has introduced at the annual shareholders meeting, and what happened with those resolutions? How were they received?
Yeah, and I'll
then,
tell.
third part, and I'll remind you of this later if you can't remember. Tell us about any other successful shareholder activism in other parts of the U.S.
Okay, and a little bit about the process of presenting a shareholder resolution. So we have been doing this for about 5 or 6 years. Presenting a shareholder resolution sounds simple, but it's actually pretty complex due to the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission and their rules that you have to follow, or your resolution gets thrown out immediately. The main rule is that you can't tell a company how to operate their day-to-day business. So, however much we'd like to tell PNM to abandon all fossil fuels and nuclear and support communities generating their own electricity, and maybe even focus on becoming primarily a transmission company, we can't do that. The other thing is that companies can go to the Securities and Exchange Commission and ask for them to omit these resolutions from their proxy ballot that all their shareholders vote on once a year. So as a result of these limitations, we've been using templates for resolutions that have been presented nationally to other companies and have already had a lot of traction and gotten a lot of shareholder support. It's a big movement, and shareholder resolutions focus on all kinds of issues, on getting diversity on the board, on transparency as to how the company is lobbying, on human rights issues, on climate change. And they're a really great way to hold a company's feet to the fire. So another thing which Wendy mentioned, but I'll say again, is that resolutions aren't unfortunately binding on the company, but they really do indicate the will of the shareholders. And even if we get a low percentage of votes, we feel it's a great way to bring up concerns to both shareholders and the public. And we always try to get, press coverage for what we're doing. So, when we started this, initially our resolutions got extraordinary support. We were really thrilled from the large funds like Vanguard and BlackRock, who own the majority of our local company's shares. I felt like we were really riding a wave. Could I have the first slide, please? Is there nope, not that one, the next one. It's the one with the pie chart, please. Yeah, here we go. This is PNM's generation portfolio in 2015 when we got going. As you can see, the majority of their generation was from coal. They had nuclear, natural gas, not very different from where they are today, unfortunately. Tiny amount, 8% of renewables. And they really didn't even seem to be thinking of renewables as a viable alternative. So for example, could I have the next slide, please? We asked them, this slide is a little misleading because the resolution that actually got 49.9% of the vote was another one. It was one where we asked how PNM was going to respond given the requirements of the Paris Climate Accord. But the one, the transparency or sustainability resolution got good support too. I think it got over 40%. And as a result, PNM, they set up a sustainability section on their website, and I can't remember who it was, but one of the chief executives thanked us for calling their attention to the lack of sustainability reporting. So it's a place we can go to and see what they think they're doing in terms of sustainability. Could I have the next slide, please? Oh, here it is. Okay, so this is their executive pay. This year, again, it wasn't that different when we started a few years ago. So one of our resolutions asked them to include sustainability and greenhouse gas reductions as measures for this pay. This pay, $5 million, as you can see, to their CEO, $4 million to the CFO. It's based primarily on stock prices. So it's based on short-term gain. It's not based on what's good for New Mexico or probably what's good for the company in the long term as it adapts to, you know, the future and our climate condition. They also give, I think there's 20% or something. It's a small percent given to ratepayer satisfaction, but the primary metric that they're using is stock price. So we'd like to change this. And of course, we want to call attention to it. So PNM, in opposing this resolution, they argued that the pay you know, is in line with what other utility CEOs are getting, kind of a circular argument, we thought. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is us, or some of us. This was the first year PNM was totally unprepared for us, or they were unprepared for us. I don't know about totally, but they did not go to the Security and Exchange Commission as they could have with lawyers to fight our resolutions and get them jettisoned. But they did, for the first time, I think ever, but maybe just in a long time, they moved their meeting to Texas. And I think all of us were surprised. We were on the airplane with Pat Vincent-Coulon, their CEO, and met each other there, and I think surprised each other. And so we followed them to Texas, and we had the support, which was great, of local environmental groups and Code Pink in a demonstration outside. The second year, they were more prepared, and they went and hired lawyers so that our resolutions would not be presented to the rest of the shareholders. And we went out and hired our own lawyers, and the Security and Exchange Commission took our side, and the resolutions were on the proxy ballot. And again, they got great support, in fact, even better than the first year, I think. So since then, it's gotten a little harder. PNM's continued to hire lawyers, and they've also gone to some of these investment advisory groups, you know, to argue their case and why our resolution should not be included for votes. They've also gotten a little bit more in sync with the times. I mean, they've decided to abandon the last 2 units of San Juan, which they hadn't at the point that we started. But as I told you with the pie chart earlier, their generation mix they're just not moving fast enough. And another thing is that the Trump Security and Exchange Commission is less friendly, and more of our resolutions have been disallowed. They even want to change the rules so that to present a resolution, you would have to own a larger percentage of the company, which, you know, of course we feel.
Excuse me for a second, Dee. Can we take the slide down now so we?
Yeah, you can take it down.
Okay, can we take the share screen off, Saraswati, please? Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, we have a less friendly SEC, and you know, if they and they do want to make it so that people like us can't present resolutions, people with only relatively $2,000 of stock, but that you'd have to own a large percentage. So we all need to work against that. That would be way less democratic and really reduce the pressure for corporate accountability. So anyway, moving forward, I guess Roxanne's not going to ask me my next question, which is about the current state. So since then, we've persisted, and
I was waiting for you to finish answering that one first.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to ask me the next question, Roxanne?
Good idea. Go ahead and you state the question and then you can.
The question is, well, so how have you dealt with that, and what have you been presenting in the last few years? So one of our focuses has been the composition of the board. Currently, PNM's board is mainly composed of industry executives, utility executives who, from the research we've done, they jump back and forth between each other's boards. And so we submitted a resolution asking them to bring people on board who had climate expertise. And for this resolution, we followed a template that had been presented to Exxon and had been successful. Exxon had actually negotiated with the shareholder proponents, and they had ended up hiring the head of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, Mary, I've forgotten her last name, onto their board. And the second area of our focus, which you'll hear about later from, I think, Sam and Andy, Paul and Andy, has to do with stranded assets. We've used these resolutions to call attention to, or we've wanted to use these resolutions, because I'm not sure which ones actually have been voted on, to call attention to their ongoing investment in Palo Verde nuclear and their plan to build this natural gas plant, both of which things we think are, we really oppose. Bad ideas. Could I have the next slide, please? Next slide.
Yeah, there's just a little bit of a delay. I think she's
Okay.
getting it up. There we go.
Yeah, so this, you can see, is the coal mine, and in the distance, San Juan power plant. And this year, the only resolution that the Security and Exchange Commission allowed us to present had to do with PNM's handling of coal ash. Since the power plant started, there have been 59 million tons of coal ash created, and this all has been stuffed back into this open pit mine with a layer of surface mine with a layer of topsoil on top of it, not far from the San Juan River. Now, coal ash, when it's dry, it's it's not so dangerous. It's vitrified and not so dangerous, but when wet, it begins to release terribly dangerous toxins, dangerous to nature and to human beings. And experts have testified that eventually groundwater will saturate this mine, and there is the potential of it contaminating the area and the San Juan River. So I don't know where my, so anyway, PNM, in arguing against our resolution, said, first of all, that they did not own them. They did not own the mine, which is true, but they did create the waste that is being stuffed back into it. And secondly, that they will not be creating any more coal ash to stuff back into it in the future. So that was their argument. Unfortunately, we didn't get a great vote on this one, but we will continue to pay. It needs to be paid attention to going forward, and we will. So there you have it, and we'll be doing more resolutions next year. And as Wendy said, I really hope that some of you who are out there might join us in this little effort. Thank you.
Thanks, Dee. Okay, next question. We know that many members of this group, as you've been talking about, have attended the PNM annual shareholders meeting the last several years. I know Paul and I have been to some of them. And you've asked questions at the meeting in person. Well, this year it was a online meeting because of the pandemic. But you've asked questions about aspects of PNM's operations that you felt are disingenuous, misleading, or disregarding the ratepayers' interests. So Sam, this question is for you. I know you asked PNM at the May meeting, I think that was back on May 12th, if they would take some of their profits to provide relief to low-income ratepayers during the pandemic. So if you can tell us about that, and then Paul and Andy are going to tell us about some of the other questions that were posed at the last meeting.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Roxanne. So, of course, the person who board chair and president, which is, as we said, Pat Kalan, she has a yearly salary of about $5 million last year. And she serves in all three positions for the company. So she has tremendous power. So it's really a top-down organization, even more than most corporations. So again, of course, this was a question, and she responded to our request that some electric bills be canceled during the pandemic with a story about PNM employees that were volunteering to personally pay electric bills for what she said were struggling customers. Well, this is a pretty typical response that doesn't really address our concerns or address the question that we asked. She also said that they're expanding their so-called Good Neighbor Fund, in which the company matches tax-deductible donations from customers to provide grants to those who are unable to pay their electric bills. So this fund, this so-called Good Neighbor Fund, provides relief to what is almost certainly a very small portion of the thousands of truly struggling customers, especially the nearly 200,000 New Mexico workers that have applied for unemployment benefits since late March, and may have little in the way of savings to tide them over this crisis. So we suggested that the company invest 1% of its profits. And if I could have that slide, I think is it 6?
7. I think it's 7.
7, sorry.
That's right. Yeah, I think the numbers got changed at the last minute. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 1% of their profits. So they made approximately $1 million last year. So it would be about $100,000. Let's see.
Is that the right slide, Sam?
Yeah. So 1% would be about, so they made about 100 million last year in profits. Sorry. So 1% would be about $1 million. That's more than twice what the Good Neighbor Fund raised last year, but that would only just partially pay the electric bills for low-income customers. So our proposed, it's called an abatement fund, would permanently forgive electric bills and any reconnect fees during the governor's, declared quarantine. Of course, details would have to be worked out, but the essence of the abatement fund proposal is that money would come from company profits. So we think PNM can easily afford this humanitarian effort during these times. PNM stock price has risen 60% since December 2015. If we could have that slide, I believe it's 8. Yeah, thank you. So the company's not hurting. And we feel that this would be a very doable thing. It would actually be beneficial for the company in establishing some rapport with the community. And yeah, that's about it.
Okay, we can take this slide down now. Oh, okay, was that one of your slides? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that was the third slide, I guess, that just talks about what 1% of the profit could do.
Hey, Roxanne, I just want to note there are a lot of questions coming in the chat, and if people can put those questions into the Q&A, it's a button at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah.
That's where Roxanne will be looking for questions and answers, and there's some good ones coming in, so I don't want them to be missed. Sorry to interrupt you, just
No
logistical
problem.
clarity.
We usually have to put out that reminder every time we do this. So yeah, please use Q&A for your questions instead of the chat. Thanks everybody. So the next question, Wendy explained how PRC is supposed to regulate PNM, but many of us feel that the Energy Transition Act undermined that capacity, not just in relation to what's happening with the San Juan generating station, but by essentially allowing PNM to become an unregulated monopoly. So Paul is going to tell us about this.
You remembered me. Hi. So historically, the PRC's role has been to review whatever planned PNM expenditures they were looking at. And that could include, rate increases, investment in management, or emission controls, or to build a gas plant to replace power from San Juan. And for years, as I mentioned in setting the table for this, the PRC got whatever it wanted. But in 2018, the new commissioners sort of lit a fire under PNM, and they figured they needed to do something, and they did. And so language, and we're going to take a look precisely at the language in the ETA that is the contested language that has led to so much conflict. Could we see slide number 10, Saraswati, please? So this is a direct quote from the Energy Transition Act. And you'll see that it just basically says, no order of the commission, and that's the PRC, shall disallow recovery of any underappreciated investment, undepreciated investments, I say that wrong all the time, or decommissioning costs associated with the facility. So you can drop the slide now. Talk a little bit about that. Those 19 words are at the center of the conflict about the Energy Transition Act. It was sold to legislators and to constituents and to ratepayers and to a whole raft of community-based organizations as being a way to get relief to the workers in San Juan and to the community in San Juan, and to ensure that the coal plant closed. And all of those things are true, and all of those things were good. But there were ways in which the language that you just saw up there just completely eviscerated the PRC's hands or ability to do anything to regulate the PRC. I stated that the PRC saw the writing on the wall, and so they were very much a part of the writing of this bill. And when you take a look at that one phrase that we put up there, 19 words, keep in mind that that appeared on page 76 of their bill, and it wasn't introduced until the last minute. It was not part of the bill version that was reviewed in committees. And this isn't just typical of PNM, or this happens a lot in the legislature, but in this particular instance, this was the way in which they got this thing through. And tens of millions of dollars, even maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, as we'll show in a minute, were at stake here. So could we look at slide number 11, please? So prior to the ETA, a utility would submit, as I mentioned, their projected costs and so forth, and PNM would take a look at it, and they would have to determine whether or not it was prudent investment, whether or not it benefited ratepayers and shareholders equally, and they could balance those interests. But what they have essentially done with this language is remove that capacity. And so it isn't just my view that this is what happened. As we'll see in just a second, can we take a look at slide number 12? Okay, so the PRC staff, whenever a bill is introduced, there's a financial impact report that the Legislative Services Council creates, and it analyzes, the bill in terms of what it's trying to do and its impact on the state and its fiscal impact. But this is what the PRC, they invite comment from interested parties. And so the PRC had a staff write a report or a comment on the ETA. And they said, quote, the ETA does not preserve commission authority to review a financing application under the public interest standard. So they were not allowed to review anything in their opinion, and they can't ensure that the financing applications results in a just and reasonable rates. So finally, they can't add any other stipulations or conditions that might protect ratepayers. So you can drop that slide. As you can see, the PRC staff saw it pretty much exactly what many grassroots organizations and environmental advocates had noted. And so given that they couldn't apply public interest as a consideration or a criteria, they really couldn't change anything. Essentially, PNM had a blank check. And PRC were not staff who maybe you could say had a vested interest in preserving some of their authority. But if you turn to the next slide, that would be slide 13, we're going to see that the state attorney general saw it the same way. And just pay particular attention to the bold. It's that's our emphasis. But by precluding it from reviewing the substance and appropriateness of financing orders, and instead allows the utility to self-regulate. Well, I got news for you. I've sat in a lot of PRC hearings, and letting the PRC the PNM self-regulate is not a good idea.
We just had a request to keep the slides up a little bit longer. So
okay, sorry about that. So I want to just give you a sense of the impact this has. If you flash forward a few months, you will see that the PRC had a hearing about what to do about the power and what to award PRC for their PNM for their stranded assets. And the PRC received a request for $361 million, and they were not able to adjust that at all. Let's see the next slide for a second here. And maybe we'll leave that one up for a little bit longer this time. And so this is written into the PRC decision on their fund request of $361 million. The PRC hearing examiners recommended giving PNM 100% of its financial requests, $361 million in its financing order. And they stated their reason for this was that the ETA constrains the Commission's ability to adopt limits on recovery. And so I want you to think about this. That's $361 million. First of all, PNM had a very good idea that the PRC wasn't going to be able to adjust that one way or another. And so they loaded it big time. And second of all, and so there was no real review of their estimates of how they came up with $361 million. What's more, the PRC was not able to consider both the ratepayers and the shareholders. And so very often what the PRC would do would split the difference. They'd split the cost so that the shareholders took half of the brunt and the ratepayers the other half. Well, by not being able to do that, that's $180 million as a birthday present for PNM. So we're talking about a lot of money involved here. And so it's worth noting also that in that there were 2 weeks of hearings on this before the PRC rendered that decision. And there were 20 or 30 different organizations and groups that weighed in on their request, the $361 million. Every single one of them asked that it be reduced. But the PRC was limited, and so they couldn't reduce it, even though in their hearts they knew that it needed to be reduced. So how did this come about? How could ratepayers get screwed so badly? Let's see the next slide, please. So this articulates when Ron Darnell is the senior vice president for PNM, and he was asked under oath at a PRC hearing whether or not, who was involved from PNM in reviewing the various kinds of the ETA. And he replied, well, it was a small team, our lead attorney, et cetera, and the CFO group also reviewed drafts and so forth. and they were involved in all kinds of legal reviews. It's worth noting that CEO Pat Vincent Colon leads the CFO group. Next slide, please. So they were able to craft the bill, but it gets much worse. When asked if the ETA also applies to Palo Verde, Nuclear, Four Corners, and all of PNM's gas plants, PNM replied, yes, that's correct. So they had crafted this bill very clearly to serve as a precedent to enable themselves to recoup all of their costs without review. In Palo Verde, that's billions of dollars. And so when we asked Pat Colon about this at the shareholders meeting, she replied, I don't know anything about this. I'll get back to you. Yet you'll recall from the last slide that it was the CFO group, which she chairs, that weighed in on all of these different, on the ETA bill. So it's inconceivable that the CEO would not have known about this. So part of what the PNM Rate Holders for Responsible Future were trying to do, and why we were formed, was we wanted to make things like this transparent. And so we asked these questions in front of shareholders in the hopes that some of them would start to put some pressure on PNM to do business a little bit differently. I do want to acknowledge that the ETA does deliver relief to workers losing their jobs and to the San Juan community that will lose a huge amount of tax revenue. But a pre-ETA PRC could have weighed the testimony and probably would have split the costs allocation between the PRC, between the ratepayers and the shareholders. So they definitely were benefiting in a big way from this. So any way you look at it, the PNM investment in lobbying and the investment in contributions to campaigns paid off big time. Those 19 words have paid off very well. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, thanks, Paul. It's a complex topic. So, Andy, we hear that PNM actually has an incentive to select the most costly energy sources. So tell us why that is, or how does that work?
Thanks, Roxanne. Well, the main word here is perverse incentive, that there are things built into the system that make it profitable for PNM to do certain things and not profitable to do others. And the natural gas plant that they're proposing as part of the replacement for San Juan is an excellent example. It's also an excellent example of the peculiarities of the shareholder resolution process. So I'll try to get to all of that. But go ahead and put, I think it's probably slide 14 up on the screen there. I just want to say this was not supposed to happen. During the negotiation for the ETA, we were told that no gas plant was going to ever be proposed as part of the replacement for San Juan. Well, look, here we are. PNM is proposing as part of its mix of stuff 280 megawatts of gas power as part of the replacement. There's another thing here that's fascinating. One of the great things about being where we are right now in our group is that really for the first time, the alternatives we're proposing are more economically reasonable, are better than fossil fuel alternatives. Right now, electric generation by solar and wind plus storage is cheaper than any other alternative. So it's a marvelous place to be in, to not have to ask for any so-called self-sacrifice or for any larger reason to be doing this. It's just cheaper, as the slide makes clear. Unfortunately, that is not the way the system works for PNM. And here's how it works. Actually, quickly, we tried this year. We wanted to put in a resolution having to do with the gas plant they're proposing. And as part of the shareholder resolution process, you have to tailor what you do. You have to do the best you can. You can't just go in and say, why are you putting in a gas plant? We had to put in what a resolution, which we patterned on other national resolutions, saying what was going to happen if this thing has to close early, who's going to pay for it, and would you give us a report on what your idea of how that's going to work out. Unfortunately, Donald Trump's SEC knocked us out. I thought we were going to get that one through, but it didn't. So we weren't able to ask, we weren't able to run that by. But that's an example of how you have to use the resolution process to get at. It's a blunt instrument. But in our questions, we were able to ask, why are you doing this? Why, direct question to Pat Vincent-Coulon, we were able to ask, what goes? Why would you do this when it's cheaper and better, because you can take that down, to use solar and wind plus storage? And she said, that we still need gas, that solar and wind plus storage will not do it, because solar and wind aren't there all the time. We need a gas plant that can come online quickly. She said, and by the way, the PRC hasn't decided this yet. Well, the fascinating thing is that other people don't feel that. And really we're at a remarkable moment. We're at a tipping point where solar and wind and storage are competitive, and many people do feel that right now they would do the job of a gas plant. And if they don't today, tomorrow they will. And this plant will be around for 40 years. They're depreciating it out over 18, which is when they hope to be carbon free. But the plant could be around for 40 years. And so our position is, is this sensible? And it is not. However, for them, it is sensible, because they are guaranteed an almost 10% return on capital investments by virtue of their contract with the state, by virtue of their charter. And the more capital investments, i.e. the more plant they have, the more things they have to repair, they get 10% of the undepreciated balance of that plant every year as profit, guaranteed flat. And so having a gas plant and getting to fix it, it suits them just fine. And it is the PRC that makes sure that they make choices that are good for the ratepayers of the state of New Mexico, and not just for the shareholders of PNM. A gas plant is good for the shareholders of PNM, but it is not good for the rest of us. As a sideline, we also asked, well, if you are going to do this, why in God's name would you choose El Paso as, and you can put the first slide up there, the next slide.
Should be what, 18? Yeah.
El Paso Natural Gas, which, well, I mean, just to say, they got a sweetheart contract to get paid for their capital investment and a fixed amount of delivered gas through the end of the contract 18 years from now, even if this plant goes offline sometime between now and then. And things are changing so fast in the energy production world that it could well. So they got a sweetheart deal. Plus, El Paso Natural Gas has an absolutely terrible safety record. They are not the people you want bringing gas up and supplying it to the plant in any rational world. Interestingly enough, we asked Pat Vincent-Coulon, what about this? Why would you choose this company? And she said, well, geez, I had no idea of their safety record. Well, this slide and the next, you can go to the next slide. We're the product of about 5 minutes on the internet, so it's not hard to find. So it's hardly credible that she didn't know that this is not the company you'd want doing this. A further question. This again is another reason why PNM's interests are not ours, and why the PRC is so important. It's a complicated story, but PNM owns a small part, or owned a small part, of the Palo Verde nuclear installation in Arizona, to the west of Phoenix. And in a moment of financial difficulties a while back, it actually sold off its ownership in that part of Palo Verde and leased back that section. Unfortunately, they were in such bad straits that they cut a very bad deal where they sold off the plants, but they retained the responsibility for the decommissioning of their share of Palo Verde. In other words, all the nasty stuff that comes at the end. Little by little, they've been buying back those leases. And you ask, why would they do that? Well, here's the rub. Even though they're leasing that electricity, they have to pay for the decommissioning. If they buy back the leases and get the PRC to okay making that energy part of the rate base, which is a term of art, which means declaring it necessary for providing energy to their public in New Mexico, then the ratepayers are on the hook for those decommissioning costs when they do happen. And PNM does not want to be, and their shareholders does not want to be on the hook for those decommissioning costs. So they are coming back, they will come back. They haven't done it officially yet, but they're coming back to the PRC to say, can we buy back these leases, this last lease, and can we make it part of the rate base? Because we don't want to pay decommissioning when this hits us. And it's the PRC, God help them, that will say no if they do. And it's something we need to pay a great deal of attention. So those are two examples of why PNM, why its interests are not coincident with those of the ratepayers, well, even the long-term shareholders of the company. Anyway, I hope that was clear at all.
No, that was great. Thank you, Andy. And I want to just apologize. We are running a little over. I know we try to get to the attendee questions by 6:30, but I think we need to take about 5 more minutes to finish up, and then we will get to your questions. So I think you covered everything you needed to cover, right, Andy?
Yep, I'm done.
Okay, great. So now we're going to go to Anne. So you've all presented some very compelling evidence about how PNM has manipulated both the legislative process and the regulatory process. But tell us a little bit, Anne, what are the implications for New Mexicans and for our environment?
Okay, so can I have the first slide, please?
That should be 20, I think, right? Number 20.
So what we've been listening to are some inefficient, costly, and unsustainable energy policies from PNM. And what is really happening in the world, and Greta is way out ahead of us, is a climate crisis clock that is ticking faster and faster. And in fact, the rate of increase of long-lived greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is accelerating at a rate far faster than anyone, even all the global climatologists initially predicted. Next slide, please. So we have very little time in New Mexico to actually make some very wise technological and social changes with the rate of change that's going on. And yet we have PNM that has very little connection to the science. And so here we have a small electric cooperative in Taos that's way out ahead of us. In fact, it's 18 years ahead of PNM, because by 2022, it's going to be able to deliver 100% solar energy, electricity from solar energy during daylight hours. So PNM continually forgets or disregards that we live in a state that on the average, we have 283 days a year of sun. So continually, we're dealing with nuclear going into the future. We're dealing with gas. Suddenly they want to invest in gas, which of course is polluting the atmosphere. And we still have some coal. So where are the sustainables? And they spend huge amounts of money on their website and other PR, a lot on television, on the ads, talking about sustainables, and yet we're so far behind in what we need to do. Next slide, please. So along with global climate change in terms of what we call the climate crisis, we are also in a very long, in fact, we've been 10 years into a mega drought in the Southwest. And the mega drought is something that comes around every once in a while. This is the worst one in the last 500 years. And this mega drought could last for decades and decades. Next slide, please. And so we have to realistically talk about water, and we don't have a lot of it. And in fact, when you look at PNM's energy sources, billions and billions of gallons of fresh water from the power plants at San Juan and Four Corners, but also the nuclear power plant in Arizona, which uses gray water. But at this point in time, because we are really developing, I guess, a condition in which the water is at a premium at this point in the Southwest, they are buying into using billions of water for our energy source. And there's no reason to be doing that when we have very good sustainables available. And the difference between gray water and fresh water at this point, very little difference, as we have to start using the gray water for agriculture, human, animal, plant consumption. So basically, we need to become more resourceful to survive the future and leave worn out, already defunct and costly energy technologies behind us. And we haven't even discussed tonight some of the other concerns having to do with the global climate change that has to do with extreme high temperatures, high winds, lack of precipitation and groundwater reserves, wildfires, compromised agricultural conditions, and the effects of climate-related events and disasters on the economy and the displacement of people. So it is time, it is past time for PNM to radically change its policies to protect our land, our water, our air, and ourselves.
Thank you, Anne. We just have one more question, and I just want to say to people, there's a lot of conversation in the chat about how many shares do I need to buy, how much is it going to cost, what number of shares get me, can I vote, or can I introduce a resolution? I would suggest that rather than take time for that, if those questions are in Q&A, that just you can write to PNM Shareholders. What's the address?
At gmail.com.
PNM Shareholders at gmail.com.
I just put it in the chat.
It's in the chat, and talk to Wendy about getting involved, and she's going to tell us a little more about that right now. How can people get involved, and what can they do?
And Wendy, when you do that, maybe you can clarify that, for us folks that aren't introducing resolutions, the investment's really small.
Right.
To vote.
So, say what? The vote?
No, I said we can't introduce resolutions if you just buy a handful of shares, but we do.
Correct. So there's a lot of confusion on the chat section, and basically, I believe you only have to own one share to attend the annual meeting. We generally buy it online, and there's a minimum purchase of $250, but you could buy it through a broker and get it for less. So it's a minimum purchase. We also do have some funds available to help people out because we don't want the cost to be a barrier to this work. So if you're just interested, even if you don't have that money burning a hole in your pocket, just email and we'll figure it out from there. The 2000 thing is if you want to be able to submit resolutions, but we already have 3 people who can submit resolutions, so we're not worried so much about that. But I'm really excited to see so many people saying that maybe they might be interested. Another thing you can do is advocate for a modification in the Energy Transition Act in the 2021 legislature and remove the language that Paul was talking about from 31C that gives PNM any undepreciated investments and decommissioning costs for PNM's nuclear and gas without PRC oversight. So that's something that we can all do. And the last thing, I'll put it in the chat, or maybe Saraswati will put the petition in the chat. But you can follow this link and send a message to the PRC that you don't want them to approve any PNM's request for more investment in gas and nuclear. And there it is. Thanks, Saraswati. And it's a petition that says support 100% renewable replacement power for the retirement of San Juan Generating Station. So those are 3 concrete actions, and I guess we're now into Q&A, huh?
Yeah, I think you can also keep posted on these developments by subscribing to the blog, that I suspect most of you do, but it's at retakeourdemocracy.org. So we're going to start taking a look at these questions. And
Okay, I'm just going to start at the top, and if any of them have already been answered, because sometimes that happens, we're going to skip over them. Or if it has to do with shares, and as we just discussed, we're going to skip those. So this one from Eric Gold looks like it's for you, Wendy. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm under the impression that PNM has an obligation toward its public to provide best value rather than cheapest service. Do you know the answer to that?
Well, I would kind of like to open that up. I mean, it's supposed to be a reasonable cost. It's supposed to be prudent. I think there's a number of variables taken into account around safety and accessibility. I don't know, does anybody else want to comment in on that?
I think the primary criteria is cost, you know, I mean, because when we could never argue successfully that because of environmental encroachment by the coal plants and so forth, they should turn to renewables as long as the renewables were more expensive. But one of the things that PNM's able to do is they minimize the actual cost of their coal production by not incorporating into their costs the decommissioning costs that are inevitable. And so we've had Greg Rogers on the Zoominar. He talked extensively about how they use duplicitous accounting to get away with that. But it is primarily by cost.
Okay, so here's a question from Lorenzo Santiago. Who pays for the lawyers against PNM? I think he's probably referring, one of you talked about having lawyers to fight some of these things. Were those all pro bono, or did you have to raise money for that? Wait, you're muted, Dee.
My audio.
There you
Yeah,
go.
yeah, we did have to raise money for that. Short answer.
Okay. So yes.
So recently we've gotten a little hipper, and in some cases we've been able to cobble up our responses ourselves. It's complicated, but there's some basic tactics they try, and once you've seen them once, then you kind of get the hang of it. And there is the grim satisfaction to know that whatever we're paying, they're paying a great deal more.
And so actually we have defended some of the resolutions ourselves and gotten them through the SEC without a lawyer.
Great, great. Here's a question from Barbara Grothus. Whoops, I just skipped it. Apparently there are friendly shareholders, well, besides this group. Can we find some of the larger ones to work with this? You mentioned Vanguard and another who had voted for some of the resolutions. Are there some that you could partner with to get more clout?
Sure. Up till now, we have had, you know, one of the things that you can do as part of these resolutions is once you've got a resolution accepted, you can see if you can find other people to join the resolution with you. And we've had various religious groups join in. To be honest, it seemed to us that particularly the pension funds or the large union funds might be sympathetic, but we have thought about trying to work with them, but we haven't actually been able to make those contacts, but that is something we'd like to do.
Okay, great. Here's a question from Christy Holden. Hi, Christy, she's up in Taos. How much of the profit and salaries ends up in Texas under the parent company, PNM, instead of contributing to the New Mexico economy? Does anybody know that answer? No? Okay, that's one.
One answer is that many of the shareholders are out of state.
Right.
Probably most of the shareholders, right?
Yeah, vast majority.
Okay.
So money's being siphoned out of state, as is, and it's our only Fortune 500 company too, our only company of that scale.
Here's a question from David Esdale. Is there a movement to make our electric transmission system a nonprofit entity? Municipalization?
Yeah, actually, when I met with the land commissioner, she's interested in exploring legislation that would allow the state to municipalize the industry. It wouldn't make it a nonprofit, it'd make it a state operation. And it would no longer be siphoning profit off to 5 million. I'm guessing that whoever ran that for the state would not make $5 million a year.
Salary, yes, very doubtful. Okay. Oh, no, Porter, that's been answered. Oh, Paul was mixing up PNM and PRC. He does do that sometimes. Sorry about that. I hope nobody got confused. Greg Corning. Hi, Greg. Now that several dinos are gone, I think he's talking about the primary results last week. And, you know, it ain't over yet because they got to win their races against their Republican opponents. But assuming we work hard enough to get progressive candidates elected in their places, yeah, there you go. Can the ETA be repealed in the 2021 legislative session? Is that feasible legally and politically? Anyone know that? It's another stumper.
No, it's a lot more feasible than it was about 2 weeks ago. There are a lot of the dinos that were referenced there were consistent supporters of PNM and the gas and oil industry. They are among their biggest donors. So I think I don't know about entirely repealing it because there's some good stuff in there, but certainly amending it is a possibility. And I think there are legislators, maybe even on this Zoom, who are working on that. I know there's several legislators on the Zoom.
Yeah, I see Mr. Sewells from Las Cruces is on the Zoom, and there's some interesting comments over in the chat if you want to check those out. I'm not going to read them to you now. But yeah, I do. If there are people on the call that do know the answers to some of these questions, if you want to go ahead and put something in chat, you're welcome to do that. Thank you. Okay. Let me see. This is from Rainey Upton. Hi, Rainey. How did you feel about the vote during this session, this past session, to allow the governor to appoint PRC commissioners instead of allowing people to vote for them? Anybody have thoughts about that?
Well, I have thoughts about everything, but go, Andy. I don't want to talk anymore.
Andy, you're muted.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
I think I hesitate to speak for the group on that because it's complex, but I think speaking for myself, there's no question that PRC has had its problems in the past, although those are undeniable. And there's no question that there is functional problems on the PRC right now. But personally, I feel that that an elected PRC is our best path going forward. That it's an important defense, and that even though it might sound nice to have the governor appoint, I think it'd be a political trap and end us back where we are now.
Well, and if, God forbid, if we ever got another Republican governor.
God bless us.
Right. It consolidates power in the governorship instead of with the people.
No.
Yeah, it's a good.
I think we need just to work, and it has been happening. In fact, that's why PNM has responded. This was a very clever move, the ETA, and they've responded. I think we have to take our hats off. They've responded very, very intelligently to a threat. And it's because the PRC has been slowly getting its act together that PNM has taken them seriously. So I think it's a sign that little by little, it's taking the role that it needs to take. So that's kind of a perverse.
I mean, remember that last election, the PNM poured so much money into that, and their candidates didn't get in. And we finally had a PRC that was actually going to have vote our way. And that's when they were like, better come up with another idea. Let's just bypass that and go straight to the legislature.
No, they dropped $500,000 on that, on trying to put Sandy Jones back in, and it didn't work.
Okay, so this question's from Rebecca Puckster. Hi, Rebecca. Should or can the state of New Mexico purchase PNM? Anyone?
Told you we weren't all experts,
Good question.
but I think that's what municipalization involves, basically. So they would purchase it. They would purchase PNM, and then it would become a public entity.
Oh, and I
So-
see that Mariel Nanasi, who's executive director of New Energy Economy, has said that Jeff Steinborn and Benny Shindo are going to introduce an ETA amendment in the 2021 legislature and try to get at least 31C removed. So that's good. All right, let's see. Sharon Shoemaker. Hi, Sharon. She's saying it looks like the ETA is a done deal. And Paul's comments indicate that the ETA gives PNM a blank check. So what steps can we do? Is there anything we can do to change that situation? Well, amending it is one thing. And is there anything else? But amending the ETA, or I don't know if we can actually abolish it or whatever the right verb there is, but anything besides that anybody wants to mention?
I think that's it.
Okay. Have I asked Ann a question? Yes, we did. Oh, and here's, I'm going to try to get through these, but we'll go, Rebecca has another question. How would a carbon tax affect PNM's finances? And have any other states taken climate-friendly actions regarding their electric utilities that we could replicate in New Mexico?
I don't know all the details, but I know that the public utility in Vermont has been held up as very progressive, addresses social needs as well as the renewable power. So I think that they are taking the lead in the country, and we could probably follow in their footsteps.
Okay.
Tax is going to be out of our bandwidth, I think.
Okay. Did you want to state that out loud?
Yeah, there was a question from Puck about how would the carbon tax affect PNM's finances. And personally, I think that's outside of our scope of knowledge, but if anybody has a comment on that. Certainly carbon tax would increase the cost of coal and so forth, and so that would raise that price to PNM, but I'm not sure if anybody else has thoughts on that. Nope. Moving on.
Okay, so Michael Kepke is asking, it seems like there are two kinds of shareholders. One, those whose primary interest is profit. And then number two, those whose interest is having a voice on behalf of the ratepayers. So how can the latter expect any significant support from the groups that are only into profit? Thoughts? These are good questions.
You gotta unmute.
Yeah.
Just to expand on that question, there's a third group, people who want to influence the company in terms of climate policy, and actually to rephrase what I said before, the marvelous thing that's happening right now, which makes this actually very exciting, is that seen over the long term, all of those interests coincide at this moment. It may be in the short-term interest of the company or of the CEO's salary to keep stock price high by staying with natural gas, and other fossil fuels. But in the end, that's going to be a disaster for the company. So in terms of long-term value, the company is going to have to change. It's going to have to change sooner or later. And so the value of the company, the value the value, the future of the company, the good value for ratepayers and good value for long-term shareholders all actually can be seen to coincide at this moment.
Okay, great, thanks. So I think we've kind of covered this, but there's a couple of questions from Joyce Westerber and similar from James Stewart. So can the ETA be modified or completely done away with in the next session? And James Stewart's saying, is there a prospect of legislative change to PNM's monopoly status? And has anything like that happened in other states? Is that a possibility?
I don't know.
We
Well,
need
you
one of
know-
our pro bono lawyers.
Yeah. One idea that's been floated for a long time is just to take away the power generation aspect of PNM and have them manage the grid. So all the wires, they do a good job of that. And that the power generation would be up to the public. So that's an idea that, probably needs some legislative muscle to it, but it's still an idea.
And I see that Liz Stefanix is on the call. Thanks, Liz. And she's saying in the chat, if the governor continues to support the ETA, then the best bet is to repeal a section of it or to amend the section to truly reflect the cost sharing. So yeah, I think what she's saying is we probably can't do away with it altogether, but we can amend it.
Couple more
Amend it.
elections, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, let's see what else we have here.
There's been some suggestions in the chat side around what we were talking about earlier and local choice energy. Paul, I don't know if you want to say anything about local choice.
That would be, I was thinking that when we were talking about other ways that, when Sam was talking about our becoming, that one of the things that we could do if they were just reduced to doing the transmission is to introduce things like local choice energy. And that was a bill that died very quickly in 2019, wasn't introduced in 2020, but it would allow a city or a county to basically go, first they could just go online and organize their own power arrangement, PPA, with providers from out of state or from within state and purchase their energy that way and bypass PNM except for the transmission costs. And tribes could do this. It's sort of like community solar on steroids. And that's something we will certainly be introducing in 2021. Not we will be pushing for it to be introduced. And it's something that could very greatly, much more likely pass given the changes, especially in the state Senate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm just going to point out, if you want to scan through the chat, there are some good comments. Marielle is saying there was a fossil fuel moratorium in Arizona. We can do that. Christy Holden saying in Boulder, they decommissioned a coal-fired plant owned by Xcel Energy and made it a generation station to convert to renewable energy. So I'm not going to read them all, but go ahead and look over there if you can while we're finishing up. Everybody, pardon?
We should finish.
Yeah. Oh, and it's almost 8. So let's just, I'm sorry that we did not get to every question. That's usually what happens. But you can contact the group at the email address that Wendy put up earlier if you have remaining questions or you want to know how to get involved. So does anybody have any closing comments? We only have about a minute left, but
I'm going to put the petition link back in the chat section in case people didn't already click on that, and I'll put our email again.
The email address. Okay, yeah, that would be great.
And I just want to thank the panelists, the other panelists, not me, for your participation in this and your courage in all you're doing. And I would encourage those on the attending to definitely subscribe to our blog and stay informed We're going to be working very hard during the budget session, during the interim hearings, and also during 2021 session. And of course, in between the now and the 2021 session, there's this thing called the election. And we've got some work to do there as well. And so stay tuned, stay involved, and stay active. It's the only way we fix this
And
mess.
just a couple more quick comments from the chat. Liz Stefanix is saying that if individuals are interested in working on a community solar bill, to contact her, and that's lstefanix@msn.com. You'll find that over in the chat, lstefanix@msn.com. And I guess she's working on that with Senator Souls, because he mentions that later on. So it's 8:01. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm sorry we didn't get to every single question, but thank you to our panelists. Really appreciate it, all of you. Lots of information to take in, and I hope everybody who was on the call tonight learned a lot. I think they did.
And from the panelists, I just want to say thank you
Yeah.
to Roxanne and Paul too for all the work that you've done on this and all your work you're doing. This was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. See you in 2 weeks. We're going to be talking about the
Public banking.
state
Woohoo.
2 weeks from tonight.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.